Hi, everyone. Let's get started. Before we get started in this session, I wanted to just briefly get a view of the audience that we have here. How many of you are Microsoft employees? A lot of them. How many of you already know who Steve is? A couple. How many of you do Python as part of your daily work? So all of you, at the minimum, by the end of this presentation, should add Steve to your favorites list on your Skype for Business, because Steve, along with the chair of this event, Brett, are two of the Python experts here in Microsoft who, to the best of their degree, are available to help you figure out how to use Python best within Microsoft. I think that is the purpose of this presentation, to show you how to use Python with Visual Studio, and the understanding that as part of your work in Visual Studio, you may need to use Python more effectively than you are right now. So without much further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Steve Dower, who will be telling you about Python in Visual Studio. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you. So, how many people are aware of Visual Studio 2017, which was released fairly recently this year? 2017 kind of gives you the hint. This is the latest iteration of Visual Studio to come out of Developer Division at Microsoft, which I'm now part of. Again, my team is the core Python team at Microsoft. We bounce around a bit, but we've ended up back in Developer Division working on Python tooling for a whole lot of things, and that includes Visual Studio. So Visual Studio 2017 is the latest iteration of Visual Studio, and it's the first to come with what's known as this concept of workloads. If you are familiar with it and have installed it, this will be a revision. For those who are new, this is the Visual Studio installer. It looks very different from how it used to in the past, because typically in the past you'd get some very, very basic options of here is Visual Studio, all 15, 20 gigabytes worth of it, and here's a couple of optional components that you can add and remove, but essentially you're going to get 15 gigabytes of value and use a little bit of it, and you don't have much choice. Visual Studio 2017, we completely refactored the installer, tore the entire product apart, built it back up again from small components, and gave you the opportunity to install as little or as much as you like. The bare minimum install for Visual Studio these days is under 1 gigabyte. Some of the cache files will take it up over 1 gigabyte, but the actual install is much, much smaller than it used to be. What do you get for that install? You get the editor, you get TextMate syntax highlighting. So most languages are going to have some basic syntax highlighting. It's not quite the level of Roslyn or Python tools for Visual Studio, but you do get enough to be able to edit stuff, and it starts up really fast, and it's still a good editor. But then you get workloads. Workloads are the way that you say, this is how I want to use my Visual Studio. I want to customize it. Here are the things that I want to install to make Visual Studio work best for me. And they're largely designed around scenarios. So the first three you'll see here are all Windows focused. The Universal Windows Platform Development Workload, .NET Desktop Development with C++. If you pick the second one of those, .NET Development, you'll get .NET Development. You don't get C++, you don't get Python, you don't get anything that isn't .NET. If you pick C++, you get C++. You don't get .NET. You don't get a C# compiler. This is the first time we've ever shipped a copy of Visual Studio without a C# compiler. So if that's what you want to install, that's what you can choose. And of course, you can select both. These are checkboxes. So if I tick both of these, I'll get both. Now, I know that's not the one you're interested in, so let's scroll down a little bit. And here are two new, very interesting options that have never been seen before in Visual Studio. There is a Python development workload. And the second is the Data Science and Analytical Applications workload. For anyone who installed Visual Studio 2017 the day that it came out, you wouldn't have seen these. These showed up a little bit later on. But if you've got it now, you can go back and tick these boxes to get this support. What do these come with? So the Data Science and Analytical Applications workload, if you come over to the right-hand side, there's more checkboxes. This is the top-level introduction. This is how you get into the workload. But then there's options. You don't have to take everything that comes with the workload, and you do get to see what's included. Reading down the list, it comes with F# support. It comes with Python support. It comes with R support. Each of these are optional. If you don't actually want F# support, you can get rid of it. If you don't want Python support, I don't like you very much. If you don't want our support, you can get rid of it. I personally work on the Python support, so I'm very enthusiastic about that. I suspect most people who are here in the room are. But again, if you're a data scientist, you need all the tools that we can provide. And so we want to give you all the tools up front so that they're there when you need them. In some cases, F# is going to be the right tool for the job. We want you to have it. Some cases, R is the right tool for the job. We want you to have it. These checkboxes make sure that you have what you need. Going a little further down, we're going to give you some of the big package bundles for these languages. Anaconda is there, normally selected by default. I've deselected it for a reason I'll mention later. But we'll give you Anaconda by default when you install this. You want all of the Python data science packages, it's just there. We'll just lay it down on your machine, let you have it.
What's Anaconda?
Everyone in this room knows what Anaconda is. Who doesn't know what Anaconda is? Two liars don't know what Anaconda is. Anaconda is the main thing that your company makes and gives away, sir.
Oh, yeah.
That's the one, yeah. And we also have the Microsoft bundle for R, which includes, both of these include a curated set of packages that are most useful for getting going, and they both have the opportunity to install more packages as you need them later on. And finally, there's a few more options that are unselected there. Cookie cutter template support is, Cookie Cutter is an open source project that lets people publish templates onto GitHub and then makes it really easy to pull them down and instantiate them. There's integration in Visual Studio for that comes as part of this workload. Web support for Python is separate. If you're going to be building websites, working in HTML, JavaScript as well, we keep that separate. You can save a couple of gigabytes of disk space by not installing that if you know you're not going to need it. But we think you're going to need it, so we'll put it down for you. And if you are likely to be building your own native extensions for Python, we have stuff to help with that as well, including the compilers. So if you select that option, you'll be able to pip install whatever packages you need for Python 3.5 and later, and it will be able to build them because the compilers are there. If you've already installed Visual Studio and you don't have that anymore, and you need to get back to it later on, the way to do that is to search for Visual Studio Installer. You'll find that in the Start menu. And that will get you back into the installer. If you've already installed Visual Studio before, didn't select the Python stuff, didn't select the R stuff, didn't select those options, this is going to get you back in the installer and let you modify your install to add it, or to add a second installation of Visual Studio. So one of the other big changes that came out of the work of rebuilding the installer is the ability to have multiple copies of Visual Studio installed at the same time side by side. So you can get the latest preview and install it without affecting your main install. You can have both of them and choose which one you want to use depending on what time of day it is. Does anyone have any questions about installers before I move on to the actual tooling?
On the workload screen, if I am doing scientific computing and I have C or C++ libraries that I'm depending on, do I need another workload in order to get a C compiler, or will that be included in the workload?
So the question is, if I'm working on C libraries or have a need for C compilers, there are two ways to get those. Under this workload, there is the Python native development tools. This includes the set of C compilers needed for CPython. So if you are building native extension modules, as well as some templates, some extra functionality is included. This will include the compilers. If you need a broader set of tooling for native code, then I would also come up to the workload for desktop development with C++. This has a much larger list of optional components, all to do with native development, including if you want the Clang support that we've been working on, so that you can take code written to build with Clang and build it using the Microsoft compiler to work with other libraries on the machine. There's extra features for C++ like that. And of course, anything else that you may want to do with Visual Studio, you can simply add on. Anything else before? Yes?
I already had Anaconda deployed and installed, and do another one on top of that. Is that fine?
That's generally fine. So the question is, I already had Anaconda installed, and I selected the option to install it again. You probably got a second copy of it. That's generally going to be fine. There are some cases where they may conflict. Newer versions of Anaconda will not. They've been steadily improving their side of things to make sure that conflicts don't happen. And I'll show you some of those in a little bit when I get to the product. But that's generally going to be OK, assuming you have enough disk space. If you've already got it installed, you don't need to install it again. But there's no harm in doing it. Last call. OK, so let's jump into Visual Studio. And there's a very early concept that I want to make you aware of. And in fact, before I get too much further into the product, let's talk about the aims of this session, because I haven't run through those yet. Everyone's reading the code on the screen, aren't they? Let me get rid of that. That's not important right now. I can see everyone's eyes looking somewhere else. No code on the screen. This is Visual Studio. Now everyone looks disappointed. I'll come back to that code later on. It's also going to be available for you, so you'll be able to get a copy of it and work through it at your own pace on your own time. So the aims of this session are, I want you to feel comfortable in Visual Studio. Particularly if you're coming from a different IDE, a different background. If you've ended up in Visual Studio for some reason, you've been told that's the IDE to use, that's the tools to use, I want you to feel comfortable in that. I'm not necessarily here to convince you that you should use Visual Studio. I'm not here to pitch it and sell it to you, because I know there's far too many people that have it forced on them who then hate it because they can't use it effectively. So what I'm really keen to do is help you walk through the things that you may want to change about Visual Studio, the concepts that no one ever explains properly to you, and try and explain some of the basic concepts that Visual Studio assumes to help you understand how you can either adapt your workflow to it or adapt Visual Studio to your workflow so that you can get the most out of it. To that end, the rough outline is, first I'm going to talk about projects, which if you're not a Visual Studio user, you have some idea in your head, and I can almost guarantee that doesn't match what Visual Studio thinks projects are. So we'll spend a bit of time on that to try and straighten those out. I'm going to spend a decent amount of time going through the customization that's available in Visual Studio, because being able to adapt it to work for you is one of the most powerful features that it has, and it's one of the least talked about ones that it has. So most people are unaware just how much you can make Visual Studio work the way you want it to, and make it put things where you want them to be. Then I'm going to get into some of the Python and R specific functionality, let you know what's there, let you know about some of the secret keyboard shortcuts that aren't always obvious, and let you see for yourself how that may work into your process if you end up in a position where Visual Studio is your IDE of choice or against your will. Is that a question back there?
So excuse me, this is something that you're already going to cover in the next 3 minutes, but I was just kind of wondering, so I don't work with Python, I work with Node, and I just recently got introduced to Visual Studio, and I'm really liking what I'm seeing so far. So anyway, my question is, when I first downloaded it and got it running and stuff, there's the launch JSON file where you can put in what you're going to need, for example, for unit testing, I'm going to use mobile. So in your launch JSON file, you actually put down all the information, where your workspace is and stuff like that. So I'm wondering, for Python, is there a similar file that I have to open and start putting in my information, or is that something I already started to have?
So I will get to showing you some of that later on. It's probably not going to be in the next 3 minutes, but certainly in the next 90 minutes. And again, we're kind of in an interesting transitional position where there's a few different options, particularly with the availability of Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio for Mac, which in many ways are completely different products from Visual Studio for Windows. So the question was, will there be a configuration file to make this project work that I want? Oh, thanks, Brett. Let me just turn off my notifications there. Will there be a configuration file to let me fill out all of this information? There will be some of that. There will be different ways of doing it for different languages right now. Visual Studio has a lot more complexity around this than something like Visual Studio Code, because Visual Studio Code basically came out and said, this is the one way, everyone should do it this way. And they did that less than 5 years ago. Visual Studio has been around for 20, 30 years now, and people have jumped on at different times and done things differently. So I'll go through a lot of the configuration options, specifically for projects as well. They're not all as nice as saying, go to this file and edit it to make it work. But the overall aim is that one day we will get there. And I'll also show a little bit of how we're getting that direction as well. So projects. As I said, you'll have some idea in your head of what a project is. Visual Studio has a different idea, or at least a much more specific idea. In general, a project is going to be some collection of files that come together to be an app or a website or a task or some set of related files. It's going to include source code, it's going to include data files, it's going to include configuration files, and it's going to include some sort of build steps. So the way that you take a file, a project from source code into some output. Deployment information, everything that you need to get from the raw set of source code up to a running website, up to a running service, deployed service, a result from data analysis, a built executable running on someone else's machine. All of those things get included in what the project file is. In Visual Studio, you'll mostly see project files in what's known as Solution Explorer. I don't expect you to be following along at this point, by the way. There'll be an opportunity for that. I have here two project files. One is a C++ project, one is a Python project. Again, I'll come back to what these actual projects do later on, but the point right now is different types of projects are going to behave differently. The C++ project has, unsurprisingly, C++ files in it. It could also have header files in it. And then there is a whole lot of properties page. Typically in Visual Studio, if you right-click anything, you're going to see hundreds of menus. I'm sorry, that's the way it is. I'll show you ways that you can work around that or ways to improve that later on. But in general, if you feel like you need to do something with something, right-clicking is going to give you all of the options and more. And the most common ones that you'll probably use is properties, which is going to open another page with all of the options that you need. C++ project is going to have hundreds of options, all to do with how you build the project. Because that has to be included somewhere. In Visual Studio, it goes in the project file. There's an actual file on disk. It has the extension vcxproj, a whole lot of XML that specifies which files are part of this project, what do we do to them to make them build, where do we put them, all of the steps involved to go from source files to a working application. This also exists for Python. If I right-click and choose properties on this one, you'll see we get a different sort of window. This has some properties about which file is the most important Python file here. Typically, you end up with a directory full of Python files. One of them you want to start running when you run the project. It's going to be your run.py or startup.py or something along those lines. And that information gets stored in the project file. You'll be using it with some particular version of Python. We put that in the project file. Any debug settings that you may want to run it with when you start it, it needs search paths. It needs certain arguments when you run it, environment variables to set. Those go in the project file. So there's a .pyproj file on disk that includes all of that information. This is quite different from how people who don't use Visual Studio are going to handle their Python projects. They'll tend to have their own conventions. They'll have a directory of code and will know which file you're supposed to run to start it running. Or there'll be a README that says this is the file you should run. But it's all very manual. Visual Studio, with its project files, forces you into that position where you have to say, this is exactly the file to run, and it's consistent across all projects, so we can always do it automatically. And that gets us to the point where you can have a keyboard shortcut for it, and Visual Studio doesn't force you to name your main file something, but it does force you to tell you which one is the main file so that it can run it. Compared to, in the same way, if you're going to publish code somewhere, you can tell Visual Studio, publish these files, don't publish these ones, do this to these files before publishing. You can give it all of the steps, and it just requires you to provide it in a way that it can follow so that it can do it for you. In much the same way as a project not using Visual Studio may say, we use Ant, we use Gradle, we use this tool, and follow its conventions to do the publishing, to do the building, to do the transformations. So Visual Studio has all of that. It gets represented in a nice graphical interface here. But that's really all it is. This is essentially your make file. This is your gitignore file. This is publishing profiles, all rolled into one single file to keep it all in one place. Now, as Visual Studio moves into the future to make things more flexible, to make things easier for integrating with other projects, people who aren't using Visual Studio, we're actually moving away from this in a lot of ways. So we have another feature that's now here. If I go to my File Open menu, I have all the options for things that I can open here. Project is the first one. And solution is like a collection of projects, is essentially all it is. If I have related projects, I can put them in a solution, all the same things apply. Which project is the main one? What do I do with various projects? But if you look down, you'll see that open folder is an option. This is also new in Visual Studio 2017. Open folder is going to take you from being in this project view, the solution view, and put you in a view that's just looking at your file system. This is essentially like opening the folder in something like Sublime Text, something like Atom, any editors that don't force a project file on you and just show you whatever's on disk. In a lot of ways, this makes much more sense for developing in Python, where the structure on disk is what matters. And if you move stuff around in a project file, it's still the structure on disk that matters when you actually get to running the code. So with this open folder feature, it lets you look at a directory of code without using a project file, edit it, and still configure a lot of those settings. At this point, and this is somewhat limited for Python support right now. So there are some things that work, there are some things that don't work, but the basics of it do work. If I come and want to specify and say, hey, this is my Python file that I want you to start running. I don't have a project file. Well, I do have a project file. I'm ignoring it because it's on disk, but I'm ignoring that project file. I'm going to right-click this and say, oh, debug and launch settings. I'm going to select the default debugging mode. And this is going to open me up into a JSON file where I can configure all of these settings. So in essence, we've exchanged the project file that we had before for basically a hidden JSON file. I don't believe this is called launch. This is launch.vs.json, where you can configure these options. And whatever I have set up in here is going to determine what the buttons inside Visual Studio do. If I want to start debugging, I can specify what that means in this file. I can check this in if I want. It's in a .vs folder, so it's a little bit hidden, but you can commit it and share it with other people if you want. And you can basically fill in all the same settings that you would in the project properties, and they're just stored somewhere else. Which means that if you're sharing your code with someone who's not using Visual Studio, that's fine. They don't need Visual Studio. They can just look in the folder and use whatever tools they want to use. They won't necessarily get the benefits out of this JSON file, but they can go and read it. They can say, oh, what are my Visual Studio friends using when they run this code? And it's right there in a file that they can see and they can read. But this is the future. Right now, particularly for Python projects, but basically for all languages in Visual Studio, projects are the organizational level that still works best. And they have 20, 30 years of working with projects to carry that. There's a lot of functionality that's available to a project that doesn't yet make sense for a directory of random files. So I'm going to try and bounce between both of these as I go through stuff today. But they are certainly both available there. And over time, the ability to simply open a folder of code is going to get better. And it's, for a lot of people, we hope it's going to become the default way of working with stuff. And since projects are still the main way, you are going to create new projects at some point. To start a project, you don't have to invent it all from nothing. You get to go to the new project dialog and select from a whole set of templates. This is going to be a typical starting point. There's templates for every language you have installed here. Most, in my case, are for Python because that's the language that I selected with the most templates. There's some basic web framework templates there as well if you want to get started with a Flask app, Django, Bottle, whatever it happens to be. This is the easiest way to get started. All of these are going to be highly customizable, and they don't come with very much code. They're a starting point for you to start building your app around and get some of those default settings set. Before I move along onto configuration, which I think is going to be the most interesting and exciting part, does anyone have any questions about projects, roughly building stuff? I'll get into some specifics on actually compiling code in a bit. Does anyone want to go a little bit deeper on how Visual Studio deals with projects? I promise I won't tell the project team. Okay. So in my experience, people who complain that Visual Studio doesn't work the way they want it are also not familiar with this menu item. Tools Options is going to get you into probably the most complicated dialog you've ever seen. This has a lot of tree view down the side. There's a lot of things that I can expand and fill up the entire side. But this is the hub of making Visual Studio work the way you want it to work. If you really want to annoy a regular Visual Studio user, the easiest way to do that is to go into Tools Options and reset all their settings. It's going to take someone from a happy Visual Studio user to a very annoyed one very quickly.
Is there any kind of config file that can restore their settings?
Question is there any type of config file that can help restore their settings? Yes, you can in fact export your settings as an XML file and then re-import it whenever you want. You can easily move that from machine to machine and import it. There's actually a setting synchronization option, which will select the ones that make sense to synchronize, and then when you log into Visual Studio on a new machine, they'll get loaded in automatically. So there's a number of ways to work around it. Again, people who don't get as far as the options dialog tend not to get as far as exporting their settings either. This is the secret information that I want to give everyone so that you do get this far and you do have a much nicer time using the tool than the people who don't know that you can do all of this stuff. People often get as far as the color theme though. So if you do have Visual Studio running at this point, you've managed to get it installed, and hopefully I talked for long enough to let all the installs finish. The color theme is one thing that people do tend to find. So there's 4 options now. I'm on one of the recent previews, so I have a 4th option that's been added recently called Blue Extra Contrast. But if I want to change Visual Studio from a light theme to a dark theme, it's as simple as making that change, hitting OK, and in just a second it's going to go through and redraw the entire thing in a nice dark theme. Personally, I prefer the dark theme to the light theme, but it can be difficult to see when I'm presenting, so I'll go back to, let me jump to the blue theme. But you can choose this. There's also extensions. I'll show you some extensions in a bit that can let you fully customize the color theme for the entire product. That will come with their own collection of themes, so you don't even have to use just the basic ones that come with the product. You can have complete freedom in what colors you want Visual Studio to be. The second part of coloring stuff comes under this fonts and colors option. So the theme changes everything across the entire product. Fonts and colors work solely on the editor. So when you're in the text editor, for whatever language you happen to be using, there are going to be items down here in this display item that you can then change the color of. For example, let me bring up some code first. So I have some Python code here. You can see there's a whole lot of blue for keywords, purple for modules, there's green for a class there. If I go into the fonts and colors option, I can find, start looking for Python. I'll find a group of Python items. And as I scroll through each of these, you'll see the color shows up in the preview of what it is. And you can totally just go in and change whichever one you like. So let's say for some reason that I think it's a really bad idea to use operators in Python. I can go to that and I can change the color to red. Hit OK, and now all the colors in the editor are now red for that particular thing that I chose to change. This applies to every language in Visual Studio. This applies to whatever changes you want to make. There's a lot of freedom here to make things look and read better for the way you want them to. One of my personal favorites that I like changing is the visible white space. You see all those dots all over the screen? They're really prominent right now, and I don't like that. So I like to grab this, fade it out a bit, and just make that visible white space or those dots a little less prominent. That's one of the common changes that I tend to make. But there's a lot of flexibility in the fonts and colors. And of course, if you save your settings and reload them somewhere else, it's going to show up everywhere else, which means I am going to have red Python operators the rest of the time. So let me fix that. Another thing that people often complain about is keyboard shortcuts. Visual Studio has 10 million, billion, trillion commands in it, approximately. Most of them have keyboard shortcuts. Many of them have multiple keyboard shortcuts. Most of them will not tell you what the keyboard shortcut is. Every single one, almost every single one, there's about 10 exceptions. You can change the keyboard shortcut. So if there's a command that you find yourself accidentally hitting all the time, and you don't know what it is, but for some reason you go, every time I try and copy something, I miss, and I hit Control-D. What does Control-D do? I can hit Control-D, and it's going to show me this list of the commands that Control-D applies to. I can then take these commands and search for them. I can go to find combo. There's the command. Yeah, it's using Control-D. And I can remove that. So now that command doesn't have a keyboard shortcut. Or I can assign a new one to it. Control-D, assign. Now it's back. Virtually every single command in Visual Studio can be customized like this, and it's going to stick. It's part of your settings. When you first run it, you'll get a drop-down that says, do you want general keyboard settings, or C# keyboard settings, or C++ keyboard settings? Those can be a good start if you're familiar with that grouping, but you do have complete freedom to go through and change any of these that you want, and they are going to show up in the menu items. So if I change something like step over, which is currently F10, I can remove the F10. I can make it Control-R, Control-O. Because you can do chords, you can do paired shortcuts in this. I can assign it, hit OK, and then step over is probably not here. No, there it is, debug step over. Now it says Control-R, Control-O. And because this setting is synchronized, every single one of my machines now has that setting, and I'm going to have a really hard time debugging stuff when I get back to work in a couple of days. But this is the flexibility and the freedom that's there in the keyboard shortcuts. Ironically enough, and to be completely honest, I can't explain why, the import and export settings does not let you import and export settings from here. This lets you choose where you want to import and export settings to. But when you do come to the point where you're like, I love my settings, I've changed all my settings, they're good, they work for me, just above the options is the import and export settings, which will let you have the choice of exporting, importing, or reset all. You can choose which ones are important to export. And then that setting that you can change in Tools Options that doesn't actually let you import and export is the setting here, and you can change it again. So that will let you have a file. It says VS settings. It's an XML file if you want to look at how the settings are actually stored. If you just want to move it from one machine to another, that is a very good way to get that to another machine. Tabs in Windows can also be interesting. Depending on what kind of, question, yes?
On importing and exporting settings, do people share their settings in any repositories anywhere? So I can start with a
So the question is, are there any repositories of people's shared settings? I am not aware of any. I've certainly seen projects that come with their own set of settings. So you can, if you're working on a particular project, you may import their settings file while working on that project, and that will help with code formatting being consistent, various options like that. Many projects make minimal changes to those. It's generally considered that the default settings are the good baseline for most languages. So people tend not to vary too far from that, in part because the extra work of grabbing a settings file and importing it is actually more work than adapting to the settings that are there. There are a few special cases, I'll show you one in a little bit, that is very interesting. But essentially the default settings tend to get used as a good baseline, and then people make minimal changes on top of that. So this tabs and windows option, depending on how you like your windows to work, this is a really big thing you'll be working a lot with in Visual Studio. You have editor windows and tool windows. They are fundamentally different in ways that don't really matter a huge amount to most people. Broadly, editor windows, like the big one that has the text in it, get tabbed across the top. Tool windows get docked around the side. So you can see the art history window over there is a tool window. It's docked to the side. If I close Visual Studio and open it again, it'll come back. The editor windows fit in the middle. If I close Visual Studio, it's going to say, do you want to save? And if I say no, then I'll close and I'll open it again and it'll be gone. So you can think of it, editor window is the document, tool window is not. This becomes relevant because the options are different for each one. You can do a variety of things with pinned documents. If you're used to pinning inside a web browser, see, you can pin a document. That's going to keep it always open, always in a particular position. If you have 100 documents open, this is really, really handy if you're working on one main document and jumping around a whole lot of others. And there's an option in there to put it on a separate row, which can keep it even more obvious once it's pinned by really separating it from the other windows. The one that I find myself changing most often is this preview tab. Visual Studio has a feature where if you're bouncing around files, you're like going to definition over and over again, or you're jumping into a file temporarily, it'll open the file temporarily in what's called the preview tab. And then when you're done, it's just going to go away. You can disable that from here. I personally disable this all the time, apart from this machine right now, apparently. But now it's disabled. Directories is a very important thing that people always like to change, and I recommend it. Under the Projects and Solutions section, and again, I strongly recommend if you want to make Visual Studio work for you, go through each one of these, see what you can change, see what it does. Once you know the option is there, it's relatively easy to find out what it does. A lot of the time, you simply won't know the option is even available. This locations for Projects and Solutions, I strongly recommend changing. It's going to come with some interesting defaults, particularly the first one, which is whenever you make a new project, where do we put the files? By default, it's going to go somewhere in your Documents folder. Most of the time, we want it to go somewhere more useful, or at least somewhere that doesn't start with 100 characters of our 260 character limit at the start of the path. So this is where you can change that. Every single project that I create is going to default to C projects instead of going somewhere deeper. This is a really handy one to be able to change. And if you're working with .NET, .NET Core, Visual C++, there are other options here for it as well. Text editor is likely to be the section where you spend the most of your time. Certainly is for me. This is where you get specific control over specific languages in the editor. There's a section for all languages. This is really convenient for things like, do you want tabs or spaces? As you can see, I have the correct answer. You can also choose to keep tabs and use tabs in editors for certain languages. You can specify the tab size, the indent size. They're currently blank because they're different per language. But if you do just want to set every single language all at once, this is the tab to do that in. You'll also get options for automatically listing code suggestions as you're typing can be controlled from here for all languages. Virtual space, which I'm going to turn on because virtual space is an interesting one. Line numbers, URLs, there's a handful of options here that you may want to adjust. Scroll bar as well. Far more options for a scroll bar than you ever thought could have existed. But there's plenty of things to change here. And in fact, I'm going to turn on map mode because this is one of my favorite things about the scroll bar. And I'll leave the tooltip on. And let me show you what that does. Oh, look at my scroll bar now. Rather than being a simple jump up and down narrow bar, I can see a preview of my code. I can actually see more of a preview as I hover over it, jump to wherever I want. If you happen to have a touch screen, this is infinitely more usable than a regular scroll bar. And as you burn down into various languages, you'll get more options. If I jump into Python, the first couple of pages are the same. So the scroll bar options are similar, tabs are similar. In this case, it is specific to the language. So if I change the option here, it's not going to affect any other language. It's simply going to adjust if I'm working on Python code. Then I'll insert spaces. It's going to insert 4 at a time. I can change that to be some other number. For those who are going to the pub quiz, I'm sure this will come up, but that's actually the correct value for a tab size in Python is 8. Because, a little bit of Python trivia, just for fun. Every tab in Python counts as 8 spaces. I don't know why, but it does. So if you hit tab, it's going to count as, if you hit tab and you put 8 spaces below it, it counts as the same thing. So that's arguably the right tab size for Python is 8 spaces, which I'm not going to use. Further down, we have this advanced tab. This didn't show up for all languages because it's different for each language. So there's Python-specific options in here that only apply to Python code, things that you may want to change. Since we're probably most interested in this slide, let me spend a little bit more time on it. This first option, member completion, displays intersection of members. We're in Visual Studio. If you're familiar with Visual Studio, you know as soon as you start typing and you hit dot, it's going to show you a list of everything that might come next, right? For Python, because a variable is not one fixed type, it could be a string or a list or a number or whatever in that value at that time, we've got a choice of what to show you. It might be legitimately 3 different types. In that case, you only want to see members that are going to be on all 3 of those types. Otherwise, you might use something that is going to be an error. Ticking that box is going to show you that. Let me show you a quick sample of that. X in this case could be 3 things, an int, list, or a string. We can do flow analysis by reading it. We know exactly what it's going to be, right? Because we've overwritten it. But imagine if we put this in, if random is greater than 0.5, then suddenly we don't know which one it's going to be. So the members of X that we may want to use are going to vary. In fact, those are all the special ones. Let's not use a special one. Okay, let me take that out. So now it's just going to be an int or a float. 2 different types of numbers. We don't actually know which one it might be at this point in our code. So we only want the options that are definitely available for both. If I take out the fact that it might be a float, oh, it's Python 3.6, isn't it? Oh, there we go. Okay. We get more options that are just for an int. But as soon as we throw in, or it could be a float, that option intersect is only going to show us the things that both of those types could be. Which does mean that if it could be 2 incompatible types, you'll very quickly get to the point where there's no types available anymore because you have completely incompatible values showing up in there. If I disable this option, which is the default, instead of excluding things that are not on both, we're going to highlight which one they belong to.
Does that setting applies to other languages apart from Python?
This particular setting only applies to Python code. It's a feature of the Python editor to be able to say, this could be an integer or a float. So we'll tell you which ones are only on int, which ones are only on float. The ones that show up everywhere don't get any specifier. You can safely use conjugate on this value, whether it's an int or a float, and it's going to be just fine. Going down, filter list, that list that pops up, if I disable this, as I type, it's going to jump to the best option, but it's not actually going to remove anything from the list. And automatically show just means that as I start typing a name, it's going to pop up with the list straight away. If I turn this off, it's only going to pop up if I press a dot, if I'm doing something that definitely has a list of things to show. This was one of our most requested features a couple of years back. It's like, I start typing, I just want the suggestions to come. Just give me the suggestions, let me take them. This list of characters, you'll probably never have to change, but if for some reason you want to change it, then it's here. What this means is that if you type any of these characters, we're going to say, oh, whatever's selected is the best selection and you want it, and so it'll keep going. So you'll see that the parentheses are in here at the start. What that means is that if I have abs selected, but I've only typed A, and now I type one of those characters, it commits it. It finishes off the completion. If you don't like that, then I can take the parentheses out of here. Do the same thing, and now instead of completing it, it doesn't add anything else at all. So it's exactly what I type. Depending on what editor, what background you've come from, that may be how you prefer it to work. The next two options apply to how enter does that as well. If you're partway through something and you hit enter and it's selected, it's going to finish it off for you. If you've typed the whole thing and it's selected and you hit enter, the next option determines whether you go to the next line or not, which is not the default, but again, some people really like this option, so it's there to be able to do it. These last three options are fairly miscellaneous. You can't see in this demo file, but if I open another one, I'll be able to show you the outlining mode. So you'll see here we have these blocks of code that I can collapse and hide. This is outlining mode. That option that said enter outlining mode when files open is a very weirdly named option. It basically means, do you get those collapsible blocks or not? So you leave it ticked. If you go back in history, you'll find that at one point, every language had this option with this same name, and that's how we ended up with this option with the same name. But that's essentially all it means. Paste removes REPL prompts is probably one of my favorite features right now. If you run some code in Python, let me just open up a normal Python prompt. And I can do a few bits of Python code. Now, if I want to take this and paste it into Visual Studio, I can select it, and I've got these prompts in it. So when I paste it, it's going to have prompts, but it's not, which means it's not valid Python code because it has all these extra angle brackets. With that option that says remove REPL prompts, when I paste it, they actually go away. If you really wanted them, then you can go back to undo, and you'll see that the top undo item is remove REPL prompts. That'll bring them back. And if you undo one more time, then the whole thing goes away. So that's there by default. But if you don't want it doing that, then you turn the option off, and when you paste, they'll just stay there. The final option uses a bit more deeper analysis. So it's really easy in Python code to say, oh, you have class, my class, let me change the color of my class to show that it's a class. It's a bit more work to go through the rest of the file and say, everywhere you used my class, it's still a class, let's color it like a class. It's even more work to say, oh, you assigned my class to a different name and then imported it into another file, and now 17 files away, it's still a class. And figure out that it's still a class, even jumping through all those hoops. That's what this option does. If you have this enabled, we'll try and figure that out and make it look like a class everywhere. The quick demo of that is my class. You'll see in a second it'll turn the light green color, assuming not everything is falling apart on me. Oh, no, it won't because I turned the option off. We actually have two levels on this option. only one of them is visible, which is, if we know it's a class, we'll call it a class everywhere. If you turn that option off, we won't do that. We'll do basic syntax highlighting. There's a minor performance improvement there. We largely put the option in so that people had the ability to say, oh, I need that extra performance on my machine, let me turn that feature off. But then we do things like, oh, you reassigned it. We know that MC is going to be a class. It's definitely a class because you just assigned a class to it, and flow the color through everywhere when things are not falling asleep on me. And finally, there's formatting options. We have code formatting in Python. It's fairly simplistic. We try to be really, really careful not to change the behavior of your code by automatically formatting it and changing white space around. So compared to some other languages, auto-format, where the white space is irrelevant and it's okay for the formatter to throw it out and invent new white space for you, we try not to do that in Python. So it's compared to, if you're used to C#'s auto-formatting, you might find this disappointing because we're not going to re-indent everything for you. It's too risky. We don't want to break your code. We don't want to break your code so much that we'd rather not reformat your code too hard either. So, but the options are there, and you can certainly get formatting. If I keep going down, you'll see the same thing exists for R, and I can jump to the advanced pane. R has its own set of advanced options. And each other language has its own set of advanced options, formatting options, things that you might want to change. Everything from commit on enter key, which I change from the default because I like hitting enter to complete what I'm typing. If you're coming from an RStudio background where that isn't how it works, then you probably want to leave this off because then it's going to feel like it's behaving the same way. So there's a lot of ability in here to change these settings to make it feel the way you want it to feel. And when you find something that you need changed, something new and fancy or complete modification, Visual Studio is highly extensible. Ridiculously extensible, in fact. If you go back to tools, instead of going into options, we're going to go to extensions and updates, which for me is the second menu item. I believe the first one is new in this preview, so it may be the first menu item if you're on a slightly earlier update. We have here the Visual Studio Marketplace. This is full of the most popular extensions for Visual Studio, the majority of which are completely free, and you can just download and install them into Visual Studio very easily. These will do basically anything you can think of. The ones I really want to draw your attention to, I'm going to call out indent guides. You might recognize the name of the creator. This is one of mine, so shameless self-promotion. But what this extension does is adds the vertical lines that you might have noticed in the background while I was typing. Right there. That show you when things are lining up. This is really common in a lot of editors. Visual Studio doesn't have it, but you can add it through this extension. Every indentation, it's going to draw a line linking everything up so you can see the blocks that come together. When you have the cursor inside a certain block, it'll highlight the line, make it obvious where you are. So this extension is, again, free to install. I don't get paid for this. We'll provide that functionality. The other one that I suspect a lot of people will like is called VS Vim. If you like Vim key binding or Vim navigation behavior in the editor, this extension will provide it. This gives you the ability to jump between navigation mode and editing mode inside the VS editor. I don't have it turned on right now, so I can't demonstrate it. I would embarrass myself if I tried to demonstrate it, to be honest. And I didn't find anyone willing to get up and demonstrate it right now, so I suggest you go. If you are in Visual Studio or you have access to it and want to try it out without getting too far away from how you use Vim, this is certainly worth a go. This is written by a member of the team that works on the C# integration. It's one of the best quality extensions out there because the ones written by Visual Studio team members tend to be good quality extensions, so don't worry about it breaking your machine completely. It's going to be really handy for that. And I've actually been suggested that this relative line numbers can also be very helpful if that's what you're used to, seeing line numbers relative to the current position or to wherever you've set it to be. So So that's roughly the configuration availability in Visual Studio. It's fairly huge. Everything that you do will synchronize between machines. Extensions will automatically install on new machines if you've set that up to synchronize. So it's very easy to transfer settings from machine to machine. It can all be exported, imported, and you can do a lot to make Visual Studio look and feel the way you want, except for one thing that I missed, which is this Tools Customize option. If you go into this, you end up in, honestly, one of the least easy to use customization dialogues you've ever seen, but it provides you with the full ability to modify every single menu, every single toolbar, every single context menu inside Visual Studio. So I have a whole lot of menus shown in this list, which are appearing across the top here. If I want to remove one of these, let's say I don't want the team menu, I can delete that. Team menu just disappeared from up top. If I want to get rid of the help menu, I can delete the help menu, and the help menu is gone from up top. If I want to modify that file new, these are the options that show up under file new, and I can add a command from basically anywhere. So now I can add watch under the file new menu. This is, if you're really, really committed to making Visual Studio look and feel the way you want it to, you might spend months working through this dialog to make it happen, but you can customize everything. Keyboard shortcuts, menu layout, menu locations, it's all there, it's all available to do that. And there is one extension that's gone above and beyond to make this even easier, because if you've come from RStudio and you're using the R tooling, and you just want it to look like RStudio, then you can go to RTools and select this Data Science Settings option, which I'm not going to proceed with because it's going to spoil the rest of my day right now. But if you jump through this, it's going to modify all of these settings for you and give you Visual Studio that looks like RStudio. Matching shortcuts, matching window layout, similar toolbars. It is the total conversion for Visual Studio that will get you into an environment you're used to if that environment is RStudio. We don't currently have anything similar for other IDEs, but again, this is something that you can go through and set up yourself, export, and say, hey, here are the Visual Studio settings to be like PyCharm. Here are the Visual Studio settings to be like PyDev. Here are the Visual Studio settings to be like whatever other IDE you like, and those can then be imported by anyone. The RStudio ones, if you're using the R tools, are already built in. So that's customization. I'm about to move on to some Python and R-specific stuff. Does anyone want to ask any more sort of broad Visual Studio questions before I do that? Yeah.
So is there any feature for managing parentheses? Like if you're coding, you're nesting several loops within one another and conditional logic and stuff like that. It's easy to get lost, with your parentheses, knowing where to close.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. So the question is there any management for parentheses? In most languages, I believe you're going to get auto-close for starters. So every time I add an open one, it's going to add a closed one, and we'll do that for whatever shape we want.
And that's available as well?
It should be. It should be. So the functionality is part of Visual Studio. It's opt-in per language from the language implementer point of view. So the people responsible for the language support have got to say, I want to enable this, I want to use it. And then it's really simple for them to do that. But if they haven't done it, then it's not necessarily going to be available. Certainly C#, C++, Python, I believe all do this already. F# certainly does. All the JavaScript and similar languages are going to do it as well. So the vast majority certainly do. And as you can see, it's not very bright. But as I select one, it's highlighted slightly. The other one highlights. Again, if I want that to be more obvious, then it's a matter of, let's go to fonts and colors. And if I find brace matching, here is the background color for brace matching. I can change that to red. And that didn't actually work in Python. Oh, we have a bug on that, yeah. Our team does not have a bug on that. So because I changed the background color for brace matching to red, it's now really obvious where they match up. So yeah, that should come as standard for every language. And if not, fine, like you can report an issue. Reporting an issue in Visual Studio 2017. We love it when people do this, by the way. There's a send feedback button up here that goes to report a problem. If you hit a problem or something doesn't work or you can't figure out how to do something, report it through this. Even if it's just that you can't figure out how to do something, from the point of view of the people who say Visual Studio should be really usable, that's a problem. So we want you to tell us that this was too hard to figure out. We'll help you figure it out. You end up with a link on a forum, Stack Overflow style, where we'll eventually give you the solution. So you will get help. But this report a problem is a great way to do that. So if someone has it up and wants to report a problem and say, I changed the brace matching color for Python and it didn't work, then I will get a bug filed against me until I go and fix that. Yes?
So regarding the saving the settings, is there an option to save multiple settings? So in other words, instead of exporting and importing, I want to have multiple settings, customized settings.
Customize, as in you mean a subset of the total settings?
Yeah, so I want to have 2 or 3 sets of these settings.
Yes. So when you do go to import export settings, you can choose exactly which ones you want to be exporting. So from here, I would start by doing that, and you'll find under options, text editor.
No. So what I meant to say is there an option for me to save my settings into a group called as C1, and there are another setting saved as C2, and apply them on the fly instead of exporting and importing?
Yeah, so there is some functionality in the C# support for using.
Seems like a useful thing to have.
It absolutely is. I believe there's extensions available for that. The C# and VB and F# editors have the ability to detect, I forget exactly what it's called, but it's like a standard format of saying here is the text formatting for this project. And they're able to detect that file in a directory and say, okay, we'll update the settings to match that project. If you want to do multiple settings, the way you're suggesting, the standard way in Visual Studio would be to export multiple times to different files and then import those files. So it's not quite as simple as a dropdown in the product, but it's certainly going to behave that way because when you only export a selection of settings, when you import those settings, it's only going to update those settings as well. So you can export two different files with just the C# settings or just the Python settings, just the R settings, then choose which one you want to import, and it's only going to update those settings. So it's a couple of extra steps. As I say, I believe there's extensions that will make that easier. I don't personally use any of those, so I can't recommend. But that's a great question. I'm sure it's being considered and worked on as a feature before. I don't know if it's in progress or coming soon at this point, but I'm sure there's an extension that can help with that. And as I say, there's some per project stuff to help out. Yes?
I'm not sure if this is exactly relevant to what it's saying because, so for example, I don't have specific Visual Studio, I have Visual Studio Code, but granted there's a settings.json file there, and you can have different instances of your editor, depending on what you're working in or your workplace. So maybe in one instance you can have your settings.json for one thing, and another instance different settings, which is kind of what I've been doing for different projects.
Do they persist when you go back to it?
If you open the same project or workspace that you were working in for that instance, yes.
Yeah, so per instance settings, like in Visual Studio Code, don't currently exist in Visual Studio, simply because the instance-ness of Visual Studio doesn't really exist at this point. The best you can get as far as 2 separate instances is having Visual Studio and Visual Studio Preview, which is going to have extra updates in it that have not yet been released as stable to everyone. Those are separate instances. So you can have totally different settings between Preview and the main Visual Studio release because they are separate. It is technically possible to have as many instances as you like, but it has not been justified as worth the confusion that it's likely to cause to enable that right now. So, but I would not be at all surprised to see Visual Studio get to the same sort of per project settings that Visual Studio Code uses. Any other questions before we move on? Yes? Am I going to talk about debugging Python? Very briefly. The short answer to debugging Python is yes, you can. And if you're used to debugging anything else in Visual Studio, it's much the same. If you're not used to debugging in Visual Studio, then I cannot cover Visual Studio's debugging functionality in 2 hours because it is probably the most complete debugger on the market at the moment. So suffice to say that, yes, you can. I'll demonstrate very briefly some of the base functionality, but I'm not going to go in depth into that right now. There's plenty of material online that applies to most languages in Visual Studio. Okay, so let me close all of that. I just realized that I missed a very important topic, so let me cover that quickly. Who uses Git? Who knew that you could use Git from within Visual Studio? Cool. Who knows how to use Git? That's a lot fewer hands up than before. Who knows how to use Git from within Visual Studio? Honestly, I've been learning Git very slowly for a long time, but when I tried to use it from Visual Studio, I got it straight away. It's certainly been one of the most intuitive ways of dealing with Git that I've ever come across. And so I'm quite happy to recommend it. Let's quickly do that. If you are following along, this is something that you can join in with. This will make sure that you've got all the sample code that I've been showing and the stuff I'm about to go into in a bit more depth. The Team Explorer window is the home of collaboration in Visual Studio. You can get to it through View, Team Explorer. You can get to it through the Team menu that I deleted in an earlier demo. But View Team Explorer is a good way to get into it. You'll see a couple of options there. And all we really want to start with is click on Manage Connections, which is the non-obvious part of how to do this. And that's going to get you to a page that has some options. This has some Git repositories I've already cloned before, but we're going to clone a new one. You probably don't have any showing up here. But because Git is basically the #1 version control system inside Visual Studio these days, it's the main one that you'll be pushed towards using. We've gone all in. In case you haven't been keeping up, basically every single big project at Microsoft is now using Git, which includes Windows, which includes Visual Studio. Basically, every big project that's going on is all running out of Git. And largely Git running on visualstudio.com. So you can actually sign up and be using the same Git system that is capable of handling Windows, which I probably don't have to tell you is a very, very, very big project. The Visual Studio repository is a number of gigabytes large for a single, working directory. And the history is even more significant. So if you do work on projects that are that big and have a need for Git beyond what GitHub is capable of, then Visual Studio Team Services, which is visualstudio.com, you can get free accounts there, is certainly going to be capable of handling it. But the repository that we're cloning right now is from GitHub. So if you get into the Team Explorer page, connect, manage connection buttons, and we're going to clone a repository. And the repository is coming from my personal account, Zooba, Z-O-O-B-A, /PyData example, which I'll leave up on the screen long enough. You can see a few people entering it in. That's right. GitHub.com/Zooba, Z-O-O-B-A, /PyData example, or one word. Capitalization shouldn't matter. And then I'm just going to hit clone on that. If we all hit clone at exactly the same time, GitHub's probably not going to notice, but I'm sure the Wi-Fi here will notice. And it might not work as well. Then again, it's not a huge repository.
So on 3.
On 3. Everyone ready? And of course, the demo Wi-Fi is doing exactly what was expected. And we're not getting there.
Sorry, I missed it. Is it the Python extension? Which one are you?
So where you've cloned it already? ZOOBA/PyData example.
You don't need to
There we go.
configure for an authentication or anything?
No, because it's a public repository on GitHub, you'll be able to clone it down. Now, if you try and push to this, then you're going to be prompted for authentication. And because you don't have it, you're not going to be able to push anything to my repository. You won't be able to push anything to it today. But if you clone your own repository, if you want to fork this from GitHub and then clone your own one, you can feel free to do that. And then when you push, it will prompt for GitHub credentials. That's integrated into Visual Studio, so it will go, oh, this is on GitHub. Let me pop up the GitHub login. Let me do the two-factor authentication if you've got that enabled, and let you be pushing directly to GitHub from within Visual Studio.
It's a one-time authentication.
It's going to remember your sign-in information. So eventually it's going to expire and we'll get you to enter it in again, but for a while it's going to remember who you are. Yes?
So I've been using Git on the command line. Is it possible to, so I've already got a repo on my machine. Is it possible to add it into Visual Studio?
Yes, so if you want to add an existing repository, rather than going to clone, you can go to add. And if you know the full path, you can enter it in, or you can hit the ... and start browsing and select the repository that way. You'll end up in the same situation as I'm in here. Once you have the repository, you can double click on it and you get to see some more information. Now, Visual Studio is going to detect any solution files that are in there. So you'll see there's 2 solutions, a Python extension module and a Shiny Movies solution. Those are, because I checked those into the repository. So it's just found those. If you do pull a project that's based in Visual Studio, you'll get some extra nicety here. You can double click on these. Or you can hit Show Folder View. That's going to jump into the open folder view I showed you before. I'm going to click on this in a sec, but before we get there, there are Branches View, which is maybe new to you, maybe surprising. I keep finding people that have never seen like a visualization of branches in Git before. And some people have, and you know, there's a variety out there. But a lot of people are so used to the command line that seeing it visually represented in any form can be a very new experience. The branches page is where you can make new branches. You get the ability to clone, pull, fetch, push, everything that's involved. You can rebase from other branches, merge from other branches. View history is probably the most valuable one. I don't have a lot of history in this repository, but this is going to be a visual representation that's going to show everywhere that was merged back and forth. Any rebasing is going to show up as rebasing. It's basically the visual history, and I can go back to any of these and say, hey, give me what happened here, commit details, see more details, see what was changed, do diffs on each of the files to see the change. It's basically, there's very few needs to, in most cases, to jump out of Visual Studio to deal with Git, which makes me very happy. And of course, if you do want to jump out of Visual Studio to use Git, it's just a thin layer on top of the command line tool. So anything you do in here is essentially running the command line tool in the background. You can do exactly the same things from the command line with Git, and it will update in Visual Studio as well. So if I go and create a new branch, it's going to show up in Visual Studio automatically, and I can switch to it. Visual Studio knows when I've switched to it. It knows when I've committed from the command line, so you don't have to break your old flow completely, but you do have the ability to choose whether you're in Visual Studio's Git or command line Git, but they are the same one. They do align nicely. So if I open the Show Folder View, this is going to give me the view that we saw earlier. This is my directory of code that just has a handful of files in it. And I'm going to start with some of the interactive scripts. There's this note here about solutions and folders. This toolbar button here basically brings you back to that list we saw before. So if you have an actual Visual Studio project in there, which we do, and I'll show in a sec, that drop-down will just let you choose it to open it and switch between this view of just all the files and one of the particular projects. Right now, I'm just going to pull up an example script, which is just one of my matplotlib demos. I pointed out before the collapsible blocks. This is part of the workflow for Python in Visual Studio that just from chatting with people seems to be something that is added value on top of a common interactive workflow. So if I open that, if I have my interactive window open, let me stick that there. Then if I'm working from the command line or working in IPython, less so a Jupyter Notebook, but if I'm working locally in my tools, then I may have the IPython shell handy, be running code in that and wanting to see the results, and somehow keeping it at the same time. So I've got a record of what I did. Obviously, a Jupyter Notebook makes this really easy and really nice. Sometimes I'm not working in one of those. If I'm working from Visual Studio, then we have this kind of workflow. This collapsible block gives me a really easy way to say, hey, take this entire block. The shortcut I'm using is Control-Enter, and that's just going to send the whole thing over here. So that just executed that entire block. And it moved the cursor to the next block. So I can keep doing that and be seeing results in this interactive window in Visual Studio. So it gives me essentially a scratch pad, if you like, somewhere I can work on my code, edit it, and quickly run a big chunk of it in an interactive window, see whatever outputs I get, displayed as a plot, which is resizable if I want. Go back and edit this block so I can come back over here and make a little change if I want. Quickly run it again and see new result. So there's a few pieces here that are interesting and a few, I don't want to say traps, but a few things that aren't necessarily obvious that you've got to set up to make this work. The first thing is I need this to be running against a particular version of Python. I have the Python environments window open here. This is available under View, Other Windows, Python environments. As a Python developer, if you have multiple versions of Python installed, which if you're on Windows, you probably do, because everyone wants Python 3.6 for fun, Python 2.7 for work, Anaconda for work, then you're going to have multiple copies installed, and you need to be able to review them, manage them, use them. So this is a list of everything that's been detected on my machine. You'll see that I don't have Python 2.7 on there for work because I work at Microsoft. And if you'd also like to work somewhere where you don't have to use Python 2.7 for work, feel free to apply. But I do have Anaconda installed, and I've got a couple of versions of Python 3, Python 3.5 and 3.6. There's a help link here. If I want help finding more environments, that's just going to jump to one of our documentation pages. We'll give you some hints, tell you where to look. But really, the top recommendation now is when you're installing Visual Studio, just leave that Anaconda box ticked, because that's what we recommend. And then we'll do the job of making sure that you've got the most up-to-date version on your machine. And if you do have another one somewhere that we didn't detect, you can add a custom one. You can configure your own environment, name it whatever you want. If you select the path where it's installed and then hit auto detect, we'll try and figure out the rest. And then you can apply, and you've got your own copy of Python, wherever that happens to be. We know people have used this with Maya, they've used it with Blender. You can use it with IronPython, you can use it for PyPy, Jython, to add those in, the ones that can't automatically be detected by Visual Studio.
Just to clarify something, Steve, sorry.
Yes?
Does it mean that if you have a Python solution running and you bring up the Anaconda interactive window, it automatically synchronizes when you run a code and preview the results in the interactive window?
Just about to get to that. So you'll notice that when I was sending code from the editor to the interactive window, I just hit Control-Enter. I didn't tell it where to send it. I didn't tell it which environment it should use, whether it should use Anaconda, Python 3, Python 2, whatever. In this case, it's going to default to the one that's the default. So you'll notice in this list that Anaconda is bolded. It's got a much heavier font name than that. And this top message here says this is the default environment for new projects. So this is configurable. If I change to another one, I can make this the default environment. It says new projects. That's accurate. It's also the default environment for a handful of other things. If I just have a Python file open, it's going to assume that I want it to run against Anaconda. So if I come into this random file, right-click, and say, start without debugging, it's going to start running it with Anaconda. And in this case, nothing happens because it's not designed for running as a script. But it's going to run with the default environment. Working down this list, you'll see there's a link to the distributor's website. This is just to help you get to the right place for help. In this case, it'll take you to an issue tracker for Anaconda. So if you do happen to hit a problem, they're the people that can help you best. The Open Interactive Window button is going to jump to this window. We also have it up here as a shortcut. So if you want to jump to anyone really quick, you can just click on it. Now I have a Python 3.6 interactive window without having to jump into the more detailed list. Now, there is a very interesting, helpful checkbox here called Use IPython Interactive Mode. You'll notice that the very first thing that happened in the Anaconda interactive window, right up at the top, is we had this big display. Oh, we're in IPython 5.3.0. That's because I've enabled this IPython interactive mode. What that means is that when you've enabled that, and you've got IPython installed, and NumPy and Pandas and Matplotlib and everything, we'll give you you get all of the magic commands, you get all of the question mark for help. Any plots that you produce are going to appear in line and be resizable. And it behaves like being in the IPython interactive prompt, which just saves you from having to jump out and change to another window for that. It's obviously, if you've only ever used the Jupyter Notebook, it's not quite at that level. It's more like the command line interacting into IPython. Still very powerful, still very helpful. It's just not the web browser view. We have plans and thoughts about how to integrate that and make that really useful from Visual Studio, but they're not there yet. If you disable this, you'll see that it's disabled for Python 3.6. I'm just going to get a regular prompt, which doesn't do question marks. It says, what is this? Whereas if I do that from, well, it doesn't know what this is. If I do it from here, it's going to display help because I'm in IPython mode. So that's the difference there. IPython mode is what you need to be able to get the inline plots. And so that's how that works. The other thing that I really want you to know about, because this can really help if you're spending a lot of time in interactive windows, is this Explore Interactive Scripts button. If I click on this, it's going to open up a directory. You can see where this is in my documents folder, so this will be in your documents folder as well when you open it up. What this is a collection of code. And if I open the README, it will explain more, but we won't read that now. It's a collection of Python files, and every time I open this particular interactive window, it's going to run them all. So what this means is that if you have some helper functions that you run every time before you start doing any interactive coding, if there's certain things you want to import that you need, certain settings you want to change, you can put them in their own file here, and they'll get run on startup. So the examples that I have, which if you've cloned it, are all under the Python interactive window folder. I have, as a starting point, I'm going to change one of the default parameters of Matplotlib, because when I generate my figures, I want them to be 300 dpi, not 72 or whatever the default is. So I have this little bit of code. When I put that in the interactive scripts folder, every time I open that interactive window, it runs this and changes the default dpi. If I go back to this window, let me start a new one of these. You'll see that I have this mtcars variable. If you're familiar with R, you know that mtcars is built in to R essentially. You have a data set that's there that has cars and weights and miles per gallon and all of this stuff. And in Python, you don't get that. Unless you have added a script that contains the mtcars dataset. And then every time you open the interactive window, that script gets run, and it creates a dataset for you. So now in my Anaconda Interactive, I have mtcars just there by default. And if I decide to take that and start plotting it, so if I plot the weight of the car against the miles per gallon of the car, you'll see I get this nice plot that doesn't look like Matplotlib's normal style. And that's because one of the scripts that I have in there is one that changes the default style to look like ggplot. So just by putting a few simple scripts into this directory here, specifically for Anaconda, every time I open the interactive, it gets customized to be the way that I want it to be. So it comes pre-set up however I want it to be set up. You don't get into this place where it's like, start a new one, run this command, run this command. Oh, I reset it, now I've got to go through and do them all again. Up, enter. And you can save them in standard files so that they're there. And they don't actually have to do anything straight away. They can define a function, they can import a module. They will be run at startup, but it's Python. So they can define a class, they can import things, they can delete things, whatever it is you want to do. You get to configure the interactive window before you actually get started. And since we had the question earlier about are there repositories of settings out there, are there repositories of script files like this? Well, not yet, but if you'd like to start any, let me know. We'll happily promote them and encourage people to go and get helpful files like that. The one that you cloned earlier is the first repository with some of these files in it. So if you would like to even send pull requests against that repository and say, oh, here's some of my interactive Windows startup scripts. Can you add them into there? I'd like to share them with other people. Feel free, I'll happily merge them in. Or if you'd like to start a repository and say, hey, here are some scripts, maybe copy them into your folder because they'll be helpful for you, then feel free. So if I jump back to this Python environments window, there's a drop down here. It says overview. In fact, let me show you something that I really am a little bit proud of. If I take this window and resize it wide, I get a totally different layout because it makes a bit more sense this way when you've got the width. So I still have my list of environments down the side like I did before. And there's sections here. So there's an overview section, there's packages, and IntelliSense. If I jump into the packages section, it's going to show me everything that's installed in that environment and let me install more things, let me update. So it's working right now, and it's going to come back and say, oh, you should update all of these packages because they're not up to date. Assuming that conference Wi-Fi works out for us. I'll go to a shorter list. This uses pip currently. Some of our future work is planning to integrate Conda into this. So if you are using Anaconda, then this list will use Conda to install packages and update them. Right now, it's all based around pip. So if you come to this and start searching for a package, it's going to search PyPI, just the standard repository. It's going to come back with suggestions for packages you might want to install. It'll tell you what version they're at. And then it's just going to go off and use pip to install it. This shows up for virtual environments, full environments. If you've installed for an administrator, then we're going to pop up. I don't think I've installed that for an administrator. Nope. If you've installed for an administrator, I haven't installed that for an administrator either. Gee, that demo failed. If you've installed for an administrator and you try and install something, we're going to pop up a prompt and make you elevate because people keep running into trouble with that. The default install through Visual Studio is as an administrator. So when you install Anaconda, when you install Python, it's going to be locked down and secured to avoid people changing it. So we want to make sure that you're an administrator to install anything. But we'll pop up the prompt if you need it. We'll show search results for packages, a little bit of description here to install. And once you've installed a package, then there's one extra step. And this extra step is our IntelliSense engine. Python is a very difficult language to do code suggestions for. It's a very difficult language to do full type analysis. Type hints help a huge amount when they're there. And when they're not there, as they haven't been for most of Python's existence, to figure out the type of a variable at any point is actually a really, really difficult problem. So we cheat a little bit and do a whole lot of preemptive work and save it as a result. Particularly for the standard library and any packages you've got installed. So this is a very long list of all the things that we see are installed in Anaconda. And we've gone through all of these and we've done our preemptive analysis and we've saved the results. What this means is that when you install a package, we need to go and do some of that again. So there's going to be a bit of work to refresh and make sure that it's up to date. If you look at Python 3.6, where I just installed a whole lot of packages, you'll see that these are not up to date. There's a handful that we're missing at the moment. You won't get IntelliSense on these because we don't have it. Hit refresh DB, it's going to start working. Might take a couple of minutes. This is part of the process, but if this hasn't been done, then you can be in the editor and you'll get squiggles all over the place. You'll hit dot and you'll see nothing. You'll type import and you'll see nothing. This is a necessary step right now. We have plans to get rid of it and make it so you don't need to do this, so it's more transparent. But right now, this is a necessary step. So if you're using the Python support and wondering why we're not giving any help at all, it's worth jumping into the Python environments window and see whether you need to update some of the IntelliSense. And finally, since people were asking about it, debugging in Python. So Visual Studio supports breakpoints in the editor. So I just set a breakpoint there on that line. Because I don't actually have this in a project, well, it's not in a project. The support for running stuff outside of a project is basic. But I can right-click in any file and select Start with Debugging. This will use my default environment, so in this case, Anaconda. And it's just going to start debugging the program. When we get up to the line with that breakpoint, it's going to stop and let me inspect the rest of the program. If you've used debugging in any IDE before, this is not going to be incredibly surprising to you. But the support that we have in Visual Studio is some of the most powerful debugging support that's out there. And we, in fact, have one of the strongest features, which I'll show you in a sec, once we hit the breakpoint here. Let me jump to that, and I will show you one of the coolest things that's out there that only Visual Studio has. This might actually be struggling because of the database refresh. There we go. So when debugging hits this line here, you'll see a yellow arrow show up at that line. From there, I can be stepping line by line through. I can hover over variables to see what their current values are. I can see in the locals window all of the local variables that I have. We have a debug interactive window. If I select Python debug interactive, this one's under debug windows because we're debugging rather than view windows. But in this window, I have the ability to interact more like a Python program. So more like I'm actually broken out the state in the Python program and interacting with it with Python code. It doesn't have all of the fancy IPython stuff in it, but it does have all of the basic Python functionality that you may expect. Now the thing that I want to jump to is this Python extension module .sln. So rather than being in the folder view now, I'm going to open a particular project. The hope is that one day you won't need to do this. We'll be able to have it set up so that we can go, oh, you've got a Python project, an extension module set up, and we can detect that, and it all just works. Right now it works best. Oh, what? This is what you will see if you have not installed. Well, that didn't happen half an hour ago. Let's try that again. So that dialog that you saw before is when you don't have the right components installed. I can't explain why it just popped up then, but we're in now. And I have, not that file, the two projects that I started the session with. I have a Python project and a C++ project. One of the strongest points that Visual Studio has over most other IDEs is the ability to have multiple languages going on at the same time. So you don't need to have a separate IDE for Python that's separate from your C++ one. You can have them both going together at the same time. So in this C code, which as I said before, you've now cloned it, you can work through it at your own pace, but this is a basic extension module for Python. So rather than implementing a Python module in Python, I've implemented it in C, which should give me a significant speed up for the operation that it's doing. This has been created from one of our templates. So we have a C++ template that will create a Python extension module and just let you fill in the gaps. We'll do most of the boilerplate stuff that looks like this. We'll let you write your function that looks more like this. And I suspect for many people, the boilerplate looks easier to write. And that's probably true. This is into very advanced territory for most Python developers. But the fact that we can have it in the same IDE that our Python code is in and our Python version of the same code makes it much simpler to work on this. I can then have a reference. So a reference lets you associate a project with another project. So in this case, my module test project, which has the very slow Python version of this function, is referencing the super fast code version of the same function, which is the one implemented in C. By having that reference, when I now hit build in Visual Studio, it's going to build both the projects. And it's going to make sure that it builds the referenced one first before it builds the one that references it. That doesn't have to build the Python project right now, but if you end up with a long chain of project references, it's really important to build them in the right order. What it does do for Python, though, is it updates the search path automatically. So because I have that reference there, it knows where to find the built extension module, which means when I hit F5, it's going to build the extension module and then run Python, and I can import and use it. And I can actually get IntelliSense on it. So you'll see that my import of superfast code is successful. I have documentation for the function that's in my C module. If I hit build, then, it's all up to date. But if I hit Control F5 and run, then we'll get into the basic benchmark program. So it's tanh, which some of you are familiar with, some probably not, doesn't really matter. It's a slightly interesting calculation that's not always built in. And I have three different ways of running it a lot of times and adding it to the list. So 2 seconds doing it that way, about 1.8 seconds using the map function to do it instead. Finally, I'm using the C extension, so importing the function that I wrote and running that. And you'll see it's significantly faster simply by taking basic code, porting it into C, and then calling it from Python rather than writing it in Python itself. But what happens when that doesn't work? This is where Visual Studio has its feature that no one else has, and it's really exciting. Because if something doesn't work in Python code, then typically you're going to hit a breakpoint. You'll say, I want to stop at that breakpoint there. And then you'll run, and you'll step, hover over variables and see what they are, and figure out why it's not working. But what if you're running Python code, and the error is actually in the C code? And what I really want to do is go over to this function and say, let me set a breakpoint here in C, and now go back to my Python project and run it, and see why it's broken. And the support that we have here actually allows you to do that. So rather than, I've done basically nothing different here. I'll show you the magic trick in a sec. Let me skip that first test. And now I'm up to the C extension test. We're going to do fastmap tanh again. And this time, we hit the breakpoint, and we're in the C function. And if I look at the call stack, then you'll see if you look at the language column down the right-hand side, we're in C, but we came from Python. So if I jump back up here, then I'm in Python, and I can see all the same variables that I could see in Python code. And I can jump back down, and now I'm in the C code, and I can see everything that would have been seen in C code before. So we have this multiple points of view over the same bit of code. Jumping from Python code into C code back into Python code, no matter which order, we're able to track it down, identify which parts of the call stack belong to which one, and give you the right view for the right place. So if you are working in C extension modules at all, even if you're working in Python, it's possible to do this as well. And instead of being in the C code, you can actually go back to the Python source code and see and fully debug everything as you're working through in both languages. The trick here is in the Python project, this is not much of a trick, I'll be honest. In the properties for the project, under debug, there's a simple checkbox, enable native code debugging. There's a lot of caveats, extra requirements, extra benefits to doing this or not doing it, so we want to offer it as a choice because sometimes it's better not to have this turned on. Sometimes it's better to have this turned on even if you're not actually debugging any C code because it's going to be less impactful on your Python code. It's entirely possible that if you have something in your Python code that's setting up its own debugger or its own tracing, then our debugger might interfere. But if you enable native code debugging, you can bypass that, and you'll still get some Python debugging without interfering with that kind of extra code. So that's one of our really cool, unique features that we have. And of course, all the rest of the debugging support is there. If you want conditional breakpoints, we do those. You can break after a breakpoint has been hit a certain number of times. There's a lot of configuration options that are just available for all languages in VS, and that includes Python. I want to move on to R before we run out of time. Does anyone have any Python questions? Anything you really want to know that I didn't talk about?
I'm just kind of curious, and again, I'm sorry because I'm currently using Visual Code and I'm in Visual Studio Code and not Visual Studio. But for example, like there's a lot of extensions for NPM, which makes sense for those stuff. But I was trying to say there was an extension for pip, just kind of like start playing around with that. But none came up, so I was just wondering if I'm looking in the wrong spot or is it
So-
not enabled for Visual Studio Code and only for Visual Studio?
Yeah, it's currently not enabled for Visual Studio Code. That is something that we are looking to improve over time. So, so the question was essentially, Visual Studio Code has like a different set of support from Visual Studio in this case. And right now, yeah, they're different products. They're at different levels in different areas. Visual Studio Code has some better stuff in some places. Visual Studio has some better stuff in some places. Specifically, package management and pip support is a little further ahead in Visual Studio than Visual Studio Code. And the plan is to get them both up to the same level. We want all of our IDEs to be fully supporting the language as much as possible. So yeah, right now, Visual Studio Code is best served by jumping into the terminal and doing pip install, whatever from there. But we're hoping that it will get up to some better integration than it currently has. Anything else? All right, let's look at some R. So who are the R users in the room? Who uses R? Handful of people. Who uses Shiny? No one. Who knows about Shiny? Who wants to use Shiny? What is Shiny? Okay. So I'm going to grab this Shiny Movies solution that's also in the repository. So if you've cloned it, then you can open this as well if you've got the R support installed. Shiny is basically a really easy way to make interactive websites around your data set. So I'll just ignore that for a bit while it loads. So if you have a data set, and in this case we're using, I think it's a Rotten Tomatoes movie database, that you want to do some actual interactive analysis on, you want to do filtering live, and you don't just want to sit at the interactive thing. Or if you want to give that data set and that view of it to someone else who doesn't want to sit at an interactive prompt doing all of this stuff by hand because they're a manager, then you can give them something wrapped up in a Shiny web app that's going to be very easy to use, very visually appealing, and very easy to create. So if I jump into the solution here, let me get it started. And so run app is the one magic command that I've got to run. And I believe our interactive window is showing progress. Yeah. This has, I'll jump into the code for it in a little bit, but this is going to take a straightforward UI, and I think it will impress you with the interactivity and just the response that's involved here. All just running inside the browser. So that's going to spin up my browser. You can see it's a local, that was not the right error that I wanted. I didn't want an error at all, to be honest. Yes. Okay. Let's try that again. Packages should be installed already, right? Ira's just waking up. It's like, you've been paying all this attention to Python and not me. Okay, apparently we're not. I want this to work, because if I have to fall back to my other R demo, it's nowhere near as pretty. So. But I might have to. While we're working on that, let me pull up the UI. So if you've ever done HTML and JavaScript, you probably wished it looked more like this. When I show you the actual page running, you'll be very disappointed that it doesn't look more like this. But we are making an Explorer page with a couple of sliders. You see slider input shows up a few times. I've really got to fix that red color. And essentially a plot that's going to show the data that we've filtered down with a couple of filters that we have. And is that, okay. It's gonna plot out the data that we've selected and filtered down. And hopefully if this does start this time, then I wonder if something updated between when I last tried this. Nope, looks like we're not getting that today. Okay, fallback is to, let's open this back up in the folder view. And I'm going to open up this visplot thing. Let me spread that out again. Reset this. So again, this file is in the scripts folder of the repository that you cloned earlier, so if you'd like to work through it, you can. And this is essentially just a demo of a handful of R plots. I'm going to grab all of it and run it all at once when we've gotten started here. As an absolute fallback, I can jump to a video that I was given of the demo. I think that's a good idea.
That's for you. Proving that it works.
Yeah. Okay. So instead of doing the shiny thing, I'm just going to run a whole lot of plots. So we did some plots earlier in Python. If you've used R, then you'll be familiar with, it's got some really good ways of generating a whole lot of plots. But if you're used to RStudio, then you might generate a whole lot of plots and go, oh, what just happened? They've all gone. I've only got the most recent one left. And that's something that we've added to in Visual Studio that I feel like I'm not going to have a lot of luck with R today. This is...
I think yes, might be the most dangerous. Go to R2, view top window.
The joys of running in preview software. Let's try that one again. Okay. I'm going to run everything in my R interactive window, I hope. I don't know that I'm going to have any luck with R today. I'm very sorry about that. As you'll notice, there's a nice big preview banner in the top row of my Visual Studio. I am using one of the latest release versions. Oh, here we are. We're going somewhere. Yes. Yes, delete it. Don't want that.
Just do 1 + 1, make sure you're good. There, okay.
Okay, we have let me run everything all at once. There we go. Okay, and so now we're getting plots showing up. Just plot after plot. This is just one big file of demos. You can go through it one by one in your own time. I'm just going to run all of them just to give you an overview of how pretty the plots are. Now, in any normal sort of environment, that's it. And you've seen all the plots, and if you want an earlier one, you go back and rerun it again. We have a plot history window, which is really, really cool. That's going to give you an overview of all the previous plots and let you bring any of them back up again by double-clicking. And we've actually kept enough information there that we can re-render the plots for a new size if you are changing the window. So if you have everything small and then decide, oh, I actually need to see that bigger, more clearly, you can go back and bring that up and adjust the size, see the plot again. You can zoom in or out on these if you like. This is, I really quite like this view for a whole lot of demos. Let me give Shiny another go. Well, yeah, I'll, go out with a bang.
One thing to point out is the reloading features.
So RTools also comes with the ability to connect your R engine. So it's obviously running against an instance of r.exe somewhere. You can be running that on a totally different machine rather than your own. So it is possible to use R from Visual Studio without ever actually installing R on your local machine. You can remote into another machine to do that. I don't have enough of a setup right now to demonstrate that. There are demos online, so I'd recommend looking those up. Come chat to us afterwards. We can point you towards those if you're interested. Let me give Shiny one more go. And while that's running, does anyone have any questions about the Python support or the R support? Yes?
Question about the R support. Maybe the Shiny is about to answer this, but does the thumbnails and bringing up previous plots, is that either now or maybe in the future going to have that beautiful interactive feature of Shiny where you can adjust on the fly? Or is that
As in adjust the parameters for the plot? It's certainly something to consider for the future. It doesn't currently allow that.
okay.
So, nope, and I have no Shiny. Sorry. We'll have Matt instead.
Could be the fact that you're using an MRO. Use the standard CRAN.
The what?
Standard CRAN or.
Okay. I don't have that.
Go to the workspace.
I don't think I have that on here. Nope, that's the only one I have. It worked earlier. I mean, we tried it like 2 hours ago, so.
You might have to clear your package.
Maybe. Yeah. Okay, so that is a quick run around Visual Studio, probably the deepest dive into the configuration options you've ever seen or will ever see anywhere. As I said at the start, my hope for that is that when you find yourself being offered Visual Studio or being encouraged to use it for whatever reason, you don't have to spend 5 minutes in it, go, I can't figure out how to use this at all. This makes no sense. This doesn't behave the way I want it to. This does everything wrong. I hope now that you've got some better idea of where you can go to fix it, ways you can go to improve it, and ways to look up online other ideas about how to change it, extensions that may be useful. Again, if you're used to Vim, a lot of Vim users love the VS Vim extension. Certainly a lot of Python developers love the indent guides extension. That's very helpful for that. There's extensions for basically everything. If you have any more questions, I'm happy to take a few now. If not, I'll be around for the entire conference. Feel free to come and find me, and I can give you more demos or we can chat more about anything you like. So if there's no questions now, thank you. Yep.
Are there any features can help Python to implement on Azure?
Are there any features to help Python running on Azure? There's a few. We're actively working on a whole lot of those. Right now, support for publishing projects to Azure App Service is roughly there. There's a few extra steps, but there is documentation that will help you work through that. You can certainly run Python on any of the virtual machine setups on Azure. If you want to be running it on a Windows machine or a Linux machine, all of those are, you get a plain virtual machine, you can run whatever you like. Cloud service, we have some templates to help with. That's kind of the partially managed virtual machines service. Azure Machine Learning has some Python integration if you're at the very sort of high level of, I have some data coming in, I just want to do a transform on that with Python before analyzing it in some other way. Python functions you can make work. You're going to demo the rest. We have a successful Shiny demo, so we're about to switch to that on the screen if you want to watch that. What else? There's a lot of Azure services that we're bringing up for Python. And right now, I believe Python actually has the best coverage for the Azure management libraries. So if you're trying to automate deployments to Azure, the command line tool is written in Python, which means the Python library for Azure is one of the most fully fleshed out that's available. And there's a number of teams working on their client libraries, so you can certainly access a lot of Azure stuff from Python now. And we're working on a range of other features.
Yeah, so here's the code that basically allows somebody that's an analyst or a data scientist to essentially create a visually pleasing UI for the very complex work and models or whatever that they've built that they can share with other people. So here, basically, the Shiny, the UI.R and the server.R. And this one that I ran basically gives you this information. I'm going to grab that and extend it.
So this is what I was attempting to run. That's exactly the same. It's exactly the same code underneath. No, they can't hear you and you won't be on the video.
Okay, go for it.
This is the same Shiny app that I was trying to run. You can see there's a number of filters on the side, drop downs, text, search things. And then we have a plot of basically all the data points that meet those filters. So as we drag around the year of release or filter down the genre, you'll see a number of points disappear. If you hover over any of those points, then you'll see the title or you see the like some of the information about that data point that's not otherwise represented in the graph. Again, the color is different based on one of the properties, so you can do all of this with a very small amount of code using Shiny. And there's a number of libraries that can do similar things from Python point of view. This is very much an active area in terms of how do we take data and visualize it in some useful way for a range of people. What we're showing here from Visual Studio is really just demoing Shiny. So if you develop this in Visual Studio, debug it in Visual Studio, and then take it and deploy it to anyone that runs Shiny, it's going to work totally fine. This doesn't have any Microsoft-specific stuff in it at all. This is supported and being run from within our tools, not being, embraced and extinguished by Microsoft. This is where enabling the use of these tools that already exist and are already out there from within Visual Studio. Exactly the same way with Python. We don't have our own special Python. We're supporting and enabling other versions of Python. We don't have our own package manager. We're enabling pip. We're eventually enabling conda. This is our general theme at the moment, especially with, well, Visual Studio in general is going this way. Certainly the Python NAR support has always been this way. Bring your own Python, bring your own R, do whatever your work needs to be. We want to help you to do your best work, whatever that is, wherever it's going, and really just enable you to get your best work done. So we're now out of time. Thank you everyone for coming in today. I hope you've learned something. I hope you enjoy the rest of PyData. See you around.